Hey, what's up, Wargamers? Welcome back to World of Wargaming. This is Isaiah. Today we're going to take a look at making some chain link fence terrain. Now this is a fairly simple build. It doesn't take an enormous amount of actual work time, but there is a lot of downtime. There's a lot of kind of glue it up, wait for it to dry, glue it up, wait for it to dry, glue it up, wait for it to dry. Now, some of that can be mitigated with a little bit of super glue catalyst or something along those lines, or maybe using hot glue instead. But overall, pretty simple build. So if you haven't hit that like button, the subscribe button, or the notification button, go ahead and hit those for me, and let's get into making some chain link fences. All right. What's up, Wargamers? So to make those fence pieces, we need to start with just a standard piece of XPF foam. And we want to cut that down to about that size. I've got this is probably about 8 inches and about the width of a ruler. The width is the more important part. I'm using 3/4 inch XPS here. If you have 1/2 inch, that's really my preferred thickness, but they didn't have any when I went to the store. So from here, we want to take this and we want to take our long knife and we want to split this right down the middle. Now, don't try to go all the way through there. Just get a good straight cut and then go back through it and keep scoring it until you can just very easily pop that apart without having a problem, so that you have something that looks like this. And now we have 2 pieces of equal. Now, if you're using 1/2 inch here, you might not need to split it, but because I'm using 3/4, I'm gonna split it down because I don't want these to be super thick and chunky. From here, we're gonna take it and we're gonna take our blade and we're gonna use that basic technique of just bringing it, cutting along, and tapering the edge down. We want to leave it as thick as we can through the middle while getting this edge right here to taper down to the table so that it sits flush on our table. Leaving us with some pieces that look like this. Nicely tapered down, good to go. From there, we want to take our skewers, and I have one skewer that is designated as my measuring stick. So we'll take that, line it up with a larger piece, mark it, and then cut it off. And I'll put 4 of them across a piece about this size, 1 on each end, and then 2 a little bit closer in, and that should look something similar to this. Nothing too fancy, Still doesn't look like too much, but it's getting there. So next step, let me back up for a second. When you glue these in, we want to put some glue down in the hole. We want to situate it. We want to make sure that it's not poking out. If it is, we want to push it back in so that our piece will sit flat on the table. And then we want to really load this up around the base here with PVA glue, just white glue. We really want that to sit in there super well. Next step is going to be to put the fence on. And we want to put the fence on next because we want the fence to be on there when we prime it, but we also want the fence to be on when we gesso and when we put our texture paint on the base down here, because we want to be able to paint over the very bottom layer of the fence to lock it down into the base. And for our fence, we're going to use this stuff. This plastic netting that's horrible for the environment, but that so much of our food and produce comes wrapped in. So we're going to take our scissors, and we're going to snip off that metal clip on both ends. And when we do that, this should roll out and open up for us into a sheet, or into a tube rather. There's a lot of this material in just, one bag. Look at all that. Take our scissors, and we'll make sure we cut all the way through, because we don't want to rip this, because if you rip it, then you got a big seam. We want to keep it as intact as possible. Beautiful. I'm going to lay that out. Now, when we look at this, and I'm not going to be too precise here, You know, I'm not going to measure it out. I am going to try to maybe I'm going to weight the side. With two of my heavier rule books in place, we're going to start trimming this out. Now, when we cut it out, it's better to cut it a little bit longer or wider or taller than you need it to be than to accidentally trim it too short. And there's plenty of this material here, so I'm going to go a little bit above and out from everything. And once we get the fencing attached, then we'll worry about going back and trimming everything up nice and neat and pretty. Okay, so that gets us our section of fencing. Clear this stuff out of the way, and we're gonna grab some super glue. I also like to grab a surface to do this on that I'm not going to mess up. So what? Oh no. Oh, found it. Found it. Everything's okay. So we're gonna lay this over. And we're just gonna start from one end. We're not gonna be trying to glue the whole thing at once. We're going to glue one post at a time, and we're going to kind of stretch it a little bit in between posts. So we just want to lay it up, make sure it's got contact to the ground. Make sure you don't get any of this on your cut foam. They don't like each other. If your glue goes wide, however, you know, whatever. Not even close to something that we're going to consider a big deal. As long as we get this firmly and securely attached to each post as we go, everything is going to be just fine. So we're going to let that dry, you know, give it 5 minutes or so between each stretching, and we'll pull and stretch and line it up on a post, glue it down, let it dry, pull it, stretch it, glue it, let it dry, and then finally pull it, stretch it, glue it, let it dry. Okay, so we got that glue dry. It's starting to look like a fence, y'all. Starting to look like a fence. Now, I did cheat, not necessarily cheat, but I used a trick on this. My glue was not wanting to dry in a timely manner, and I got a little bit impatient. So what I did was, if you take a little bit of baking powder, baking soda, put your glue where you want it to be, and then just sprinkle a little bit of that baking powder or baking soda onto it. It's going to act like a catalyst, and it's going to make that glue dry almost immediately. It's going to leave you with some kind of corroded looking spots, which, given what this is for and this particular, you know, I figure that little bit of texture isn't going to hurt anything. If anything, it might help the overall finished piece. But from here, I've also got my tops trimmed, my sides trimmed up a little bit, actually. Let me clean this side up just a little bit more than that. Now, when you cut the top part, you want to try to cut right above the little kind of seam right here, because that's going to give you the top edge of the fence where it'll look more like chain link, where you got the two pieces of wire that come to the top and they're twisted together. So make sure you leave that intact. And this is ready for some primer. So I'm going to hit this with some Army Painter black primer, because that's what I currently have in the studio. But you obviously use whatever primer you happen to have handy. So we're going to get this primed up, and then we'll take a look at our next step. All right, so we got this primed up black. I'm aware that the primer, spray primer, just doesn't usually do great against raw foam. That's okay. It's not a big deal. I was mainly worried about getting the fence primed, because we're going to be covering that with texture paint anyways. So at this point, we want to do the posts and the actual chain link. Now, I'm going to be using this rattle can of silver. Ideally, if you have a silver that you can run through your airbrush, that's the best option. And you could also get away with very, very, very gingerly and gently dry brushing some silver onto this. But an airbrush or a rattle can are the better options. That way you're not running the risk of accidentally pulling stuff apart with your brush as you try to dry brush it. So I'm going to rattle can this up, and then we'll get moving on. One other thing before I move on. Anytime you're doing little pieces of scatter terrain like this, it is always advisable to put a little piece of tape underneath it to secure it down to whatever surface you're priming on. That way it doesn't blow away the first time you hit it with the rattle can. So we got this all silvered up. There was a change of plans. As it turns out, that rattle can that I had was a lot older than I thought it was. And it wouldn't spray. It just went, just sputtered at me. It wouldn't do anything. So I did something that I had been dreading doing that I've actually never done. And that was to load a metallic paint into my airbrush. I really don't think you want to be dry brushing this stuff. You want to airbrush it, or you want to rattle can it. I don't think you want to be picking at that too much, because you don't want to rip it off the posts. So it went a lot better than I thought it would. I used the Army Painter gunmetal and with some, about half and half with medium, and it flowed beautifully. The cleanup is what I was really worried about, because metallic paints tend to have a bad habit of drying very, very quickly. And I was worried that, I was going to get a lot of bad nozzle drying gunk, but it didn't. It flowed beautifully. It worked out infinitely better than I thought it would. So our next step here is going to be to mix up some texture paint with about, half glue, half paint, or a third glue, a third paint, a third sand, and cover up the bases of these. Now, as much as possible and wherever possible, I'm going to attempt to get the glue over the bottom of the fence to further lock that down and kind of cement everything together. And once we get the texture paint on there, it's going to be a quick wash, and these are going to be ready to hit the table. And with that painted up with some texture paint, a little bit of wash on it, we're ready to go. We're ready to put these chain link fences on the table. And again, I'll use these from everything from probably World War II games all the way up to 40K, Cyberpunk, things like that. Pretty versatile, pretty basic piece of terrain that takes something that otherwise would have been trash and ended up in a landfill and puts it to purpose on the table. Thank you so much for stopping by, spending a little bit of your day with us here at World of Wargaming. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day, and as always, may the dice gods be forever in your favor.
That does it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to World of Wargaming. If you've enjoyed the content that you saw today, consider hitting that like button for me. If you want to see more content like what you saw today, consider hitting that subscribe button and hitting that bell for notifications so that you get alerts whenever I post new content. And if you liked what you saw so much that you would like to contribute to the continuation of it, then check out the description below. You'll find a link to the Patreon account for the studio. And there are numerous tiers there structured for however little or however much you would like to help out. And I want you to know that regardless of any of those things, if you do any of those things or don't do any of those things, I'm incredibly grateful that you stopped by and hung out today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope that the dice are ever in your favor.